Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Lydia Toorenburgh, who is a Cree-Métis person with settler and Dutch immigrant ancestry, and has recently begun a journey into coming into a two-spirit identity with the guidance of her elders. She's a Masters of Anthropology student and will be working on two powerful women scholars looking into the challenges of marginalized individuals in accessing healthcare, doing critical community-engaged research using audiovisual research methods in order to amplify and prioritize the voices of the community. So please join me in welcoming Lydia Toorenburgh.
Tansi, I'm going to start with thank you for the territory and thank you too for having me. So my speech is called Nitawâhtâw, Searching for a Métis Approach to Audiovisual Anthropology with Cultural, Linguistic, and Ethical Considerations. I first presented this as my honors research, which I did a year ago only, but I've updated it a little bit with my work so far, and talked a little bit about my identity as a two-spirit person during this research. I think the territory acknowledgement for me is very important today. I was born on Métis territory in the Lower Mainland, and there was where I started our journey in my family to understand our identity. So the Coast Salish teachings for a long time have been very important to me, and I moved here when I was 10 to Saanich territory, specifically on Tsartlip land, and there I've been very blessed and gifted to be shared with a lot of teachings that have shaped who I am today. And I also want to acknowledge that the rest of BC is almost entirely unceded, meaning it hasn't ever been let go of or given over to the government of Canada or the Crown. So right now I'm really encouraging all of you to look into the wet, sweat, and land struggles that are happening right now. Yes, it's about a pipeline, but more importantly, it's about sovereignty, and it's about nation-to-nation relations, and working against armed removal of Indigenous people from their sovereign territories. So I want to direct you to the Wet'suwet'en Victoria Solidarity page, which is where you can find out any of the current happenings, so you can support, whether it's financially, with goods, with sharing information, or actually going there physically. Part of my territory acknowledgements, I usually try to put some action and some verbs into my sentences. So this is just something I can direct you toward. Traditionally, we also do acknowledgements of territory right down to the family whose land we were on. So it's not just an act of reconciliation, it's also just a respecting of our practices before contact and colonization. So I'm very grateful to the lands we're on, the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Saanich, for having me as an uninvited guest on their territory. Tansi Kiawao Mino Kisakau, Lydia Toorenburgh, and Otipemisiwak. I just said, hello, how are you all? It's a really good day today. Thank you for being here. My name is Lydia. I'm Cree-Métis on my mom's side, going through my grandma back there, my kukum. And all the women all the way back, we've all been Métis, which is really a beautiful thing for me to think about that lineage. I'm learning how to introduce myself in Cree, which is really important. My family would have spoken Bungi rather than Michif, which is a common Métis language. And here I wanted to do a self-location. It's a super important part of Indigenous research, and it's also becoming very important in feminist scholarship as well as queer scholarship. It's very important to locate yourself so that you know where your authority comes from, but also to remind yourself of the obligations that you have. So here, this is my dad's side of the family. My dad came here when he was 4, so it's important for me to also acknowledge his history as an immigrant rather than a settler, because it shows to me the experiences of white people, as he came here as an immigrant and didn't have any of the same issues that a person with a darker skin tone would have come here as an immigrant. So that's my dad, my brother, and myself right there, his father, and all of the kids. And so my dad's name was Merk Petrus Toorenburgh, which is very Dutch. And then after they came here, the names became Bill, Sharon. So very quick integration. And over here, we have the grandparents on my grandpa's side. You can see them there, and this is the settler side of my family. And then over here, we have all the Métis women in the family. So that's me making the stink eye. My mom, that's my grandma who's sitting in the back today. And so these are the families that I come from. So the 3 I's, immigrant, invader, and Indigenous. So that's quite a lot of identities to hold all at once, but it's all contributed to the way that I see myself and see the research that I do today. I also am two-spirit, and it's taken me quite a long time to come to this realization. I knew that I was bisexual for a very long time. I knew that I was attracted to more than one gender, and I had had attractions and connections with many different genders, but I started to realize it was a bit more than that as it became safer for me to do so. Some days I wake up and I am a man. I don't know how to explain to you, but I feel it. There's no question. I have no problem with it. And other days I wake up and I am the woman. Like, there is no woman more woman than I am. And so having both of these spirits at the same time is what had me come to two-spirit identity. Some people use two-spirit in a very specific way, but it was a term created in the 1990s that is just supposed to be an English term to broadly include a lot of gender diverse identities that go into Indigenous all over Turtle Island. And so it's not one identity that means two spirits in one body. It just so happens that for me, that's how I feel. So this is the flag here. I started doing drag this last year. It's my drag anniversary in March 30th. That's my first performance in drag on that side. And then that's a picture of me. I did a drag workshop for the Victoria Native Friendship Centre, teaching other youth how to do drag and how to express themselves. When I started doing drag, I felt so attractive. It was incredible because for the first time I was really giving life and air to that side of me that hadn't gotten that before. One of my elders sat me down and said, well, you have long hair, you have big fake nails, you know, you wear lipstick and you're really celebrating that feminine side of you, but what are you doing to celebrate your masculine side? And I had no answer for her. And so starting to do drag was one way that I could breathe life into that side of myself as well. And I started to create my own way of being two-spirit because there aren't very many teachings left in the community that I live in. So for example, I'm wearing a ribbon shirt today. Typically this was worn by men, and I've made a feminized version for myself. And this is the way that our women wear sashes, which is part of our regalia, but often men would wear them on the side or on their waist. And so I will do both depending on how I'm feeling. And so I'm kind of creating my own history. And through going to some of the transgender archive talks, I've learned from other two-spirit activists and other transgender activists who've said, sometimes if there isn't a history in your family, you have to be the first in your family to make that history. So I've really been taking that seriously. So I'm very grateful to have been a recipient of one of these scholarships because it felt like a nod from the community that I do belong in, that this is an area that I'm welcome in. So I'm very thankful to be here and to be giving this talk right now. Academically speaking, my background is in audiovisual and music research, so I'm very fascinated by ethnomusicology. I'm always very fascinated by sound. I've always been intensely affected by sound. Little sounds can make me emotionally upset, physically upset. So I've always been very interested in sound and the roles that it plays in our lives. And when I first met my supervisor, Alexandrine Beautriot-Fournier, she was able to show me the world of anthropology of sound. So in this photo here on the left, that's me in Cuba. I went with her on an ethnographic Cuban field school where we lived in Santiago de Cuba and did research with pigeon racers to really expose their passion and their skills. And we did this research through sound where we did an interview and we recorded all of these different examples of the work that they do and put it together into a bit of a vignette that you can view. And I'll be giving you links to my work if you're interested later. On the right-hand side, I have the acoustic ethnography field school that I did with Alex as well. And here we are studying the environment through sound. So in this photo, we're reacting to a bunch of sea lions in a bachelor sea lion colony. And I use that to create a soundscape that questioned what it means to be alive and how we can work with the environment in a way that honors it as a living being. Next, I went to the Birch Bark Canoe Field School through the University of Northern British Columbia, and this was a very big turning point for me. My family had hidden our heritage until my living generation, and so it's been a work to reclaim that heritage, and I'm hopefully making my family proud by doing that work. And so this was the first time that I was able to meet other people in my community who had more teachings. And so here, this is Marcel Lavelle, and he was our master canoe builder who taught us how to make this canoe. You can see us working on it in the Two Rivers Art Gallery on the right side there. And by hand, we built this canoe in the traditional way, all the way from just raw materials to a fully buoyant and paddleable canoe that I got to paddle myself. And it was through that experience that I learned more about what it means to be a Cree-Métis woman and also what it means to be connected to community. And Marcel has opened his own bush school. One of my elders, Earl Henderson, is a teacher at UNBC. So this was also the first time that my academic and my cultural world came together. following this field school, I started to question what I was doing in anthropology and seeing how and if it was possible for me to bring my culture and my passion for sound and research into one focus. This is a picture of my elder Daryl, who is Earl's husband or wife, and this is Carmen, and together we're picking medicines in Prince George. And my questions for my honors were, what does my particular ancestry and lived experience give an influence in my identity and my culture as a Cree-Métis person? And what are the relevant cultural and academic values that I have, and how can I bring them together? And what Cree terminology reflects the values and relationships that I want to build within my work? And how have other Cree-Métis scholars and filmmakers approached the work that they do, and how can I learn from them? Basically trying to start my approach from anew, because there isn't a class in how to be a Métis researcher. All of my work, I try to decolonize as best as I can, but decolonizing to me takes the Indigenous scholarship as a second and additive to the colonial scholarship that starts. So it's more than decolonizing, it's about creating from the ground an Indigenous approach to my work. And part of that is renaming the language that I'm using. One of my favorite quotes from Absalon and Willett is that if we're going to gather and share knowledge in an Indigenous way, we must find new words to liberate and decolonize our processes for doing so. For me, I'm very obsessed with connotation. I'm very obsessed with words. Any of my classmates know that. The meaning of every word to me is crucially important. So when we think about research, it has too much racist and colonial baggage. If I go into a community and say I'm doing research, it comes with a huge history of research on our people, on our bodies, and on our cultures that have hurt our societies. So instead, I propose the word Kiskin Mahawatawin, which is to teach one another and to learn and educate together. And so this acknowledges the power that the people that I work with have, as well as the power that I have, and how knowledge comes from working together. Research is to look at again, right? To search for again. And in this way, it's let's create something new, but together. And language embodies the way that society thinks. And so it's not just about what I'm thinking of as a researcher, it's about thinking about how I'm going into that situation together. So instead of researcher, I propose the word Nahitam, which is their effective listener, which I really love because again, it comes back to my values of sound, but also of witnessing. In a lot of our cultures across Turtle Island, witnessing is actually a professional role. You are paid and gifted and asked to be a witness and forever remember and tell that story. And so listening is also about documentation, and it's about responsibility. So as a researcher, my commitment is to go and find. But as a Nihita, my commitment is to listen very carefully, but then also to share that knowledge as a wisdom and as a witness in that good way. And instead of participants, I propose Nitawâhtâw. So Mio is good or well, and Tau is to guide. And so it's this idea that the research participants aren't participating in an existing project. I'm not inviting them onto my own ship, but that we're doing this together and we're walking together. When I think about a guide, I think about walking through a path together and how you do that abreast. And sometimes someone will lead, but mostly you're working together in that similar experience. I think this is very important because it asserts linguistic sovereignty. And using these Cree words, I'm also invoking the nuance of Cree language. It's very common in linguistics to talk about Cree as being a verb-based language. A lot of our words have to do with the process of doing something rather than the state of being, which I think is a really important nuance to consider. Now in my work, I've mostly done auditory work, but I'm also interested in film and photography as well. And so a lot of my questions have to do with methodology. It's great to do all this theoretical work, but what am I actually going to do when I step into the field? In quotation marks. What am I actually going to do when I step into somebody's home? And one of the things I wanted to think about is doing film in a good way, rather than in a way that's influenced by, let's say, Hollywood or Western ideas of visual anthropology, which have had a lot to do with objectifying or studying individuals. And what I've noticed in looking at the work of other Cree-Métis filmmakers, not necessarily scholars, but filmmakers, if you want to make that difference, are three things. The narratives they construct, the editing that they choose, and the presence of the filmmaker in their work. And these are three really important ways that I've learned from these filmmakers. The first thing I think about a narrative is it's the way a story is constructed through a particular point of view and arrangement of events. So this is the actual definition of what narrative is in film. And this is very important because the narrative is the story we're trying to get across. So that's actually the intention of the filmmaker. With editing, it's about the choices that you choose in creating the narrative, in creating the aesthetics, in choosing when to cut. Is it before you put the cut down or is it after you put the cut down? All of those editing choices affect that narrative and are powerful tools of creating the effect that you want to have. So what choices are they making in order to make those effects? And then the presence of the filmmaker, so the degree to which and how the filmmakers are including themselves in their film. This is very important when we think about traditional Hollywood. We think it's quite special when someone like Hitchcock does a little cameo in their own film. It's very special when there's little bits of the filmmaker on the screen, because typically that doesn't happen whatsoever. So this idea of the presence of the filmmaker is quite different in these Indigenous films. There's a picture of me. I'm filming Tomasin, or Charles Eliot. We did a little film together about his practice. This is an example of the kind of work I've done since this time. In this film, I am not in the film whatsoever. My voice isn't there, my picture isn't there, because Tomasin himself is an elder and a knowledge keeper, and I think that for me, I was just learning from him. I was in that more passive position and really giving him the opportunity to just talk about his work, and so that was an example of when I chose not to be in my film whatsoever. I want to talk first about narrative. I think this is also interesting in the context of my research in general and why I chose to do this topic. In a lot of the work that Indigenous filmmakers do, they include themselves. And in those narratives have to do with what's important to them. So here there's a film by Gil Cardinal called Foster Child, and this is actually his documented efforts to find his biological family. As a man who was adopted out in the 60s scoop, this is a short film about 43 minutes long, and it's all about how he's tried and failed and tried again to find his biological family, which is an extremely personal thing to choose, extremely personal story to tell. And similarly, Women in the Shadows is by Christine Welsh, who is a former professor at UVic here. She's recently retired and also one of my elders, and this is her story of trying to find her Métis family. So again, two really strong examples of these Métis filmmakers choosing to tell their own story as their narrative. This is an important part of the attempt to create sovereign research, to research ourselves. There's a quote that I love, and it's, "We've been researched to death, and now we have to research ourselves back to life." This idea of taking control of our own stories once again. And this, whether it's ourselves or our families, frequently they're choosing topics that specifically relate to themselves, their families, their communities, and their cultures. It's very autoethnographic, if you will. And by doing this, we're taking control of our own representations, and we're exercising visual sovereignty. And sovereignty is a big buzzword, but if you think about what it means to be sovereign, it just means to own yourself. Cree-Métis people have a word called Otipemisiwak, and it's the name we have for ourselves. The Cree gave us, and it means the people who own themselves or think for themselves. And it was after the Louis Riel rebellion where we fought back against the government and really asserted our sovereignty. And the Cree were like, nice, you will not be told what to do by anybody else. So when I think about sovereignty, I think about Otipemisiwak, and what it means to be my own identity is to fight for ourselves. And that includes the art that we make. And Christine Welsh in the First People's House told me to go out and find the story and the people who can tell it. So not a hypothesis, you don't have a hypothesis, you go out and you test it in the field and you see if it's true or not. You go out with an open mind and an open heart as a Nitawâhtâw, a good listener, and you wait for those who are willing and wanting to tell you what you're going to be telling. So you're going out as a witness and the community is telling you what's important. Otherwise, you're telling your own story and you're saying, this is my question, this is what I need, and let's go find that. Editing is huge. As a filmmaker, you spend tons of time studying different editing techniques and choices and faux pas. And it was really interesting for me watching a lot of these films and seeing things that are quite different than what you'd be learning in regular film studies. One of the things is long takes. So any movie where it's like an action movie, you'll have very short, fast takes, and that creates a feeling of anticipation and speed, and that really gets your heart rate going. In quiet moments like The Notebook, long takes, very long takes, and this is to draw out connection, it's to get you leaning in, it's to make things textural. And in these films I'm seeing a lot of long takes, and for me it's not just about creating that slowness, it's also about listening again. So one of the teachings I've had from my Salish elders here is that when somebody finishes speaking, you should wait and take a full before responding. And that gives time for them to either continue or for the whole room to settle and for you to really think about what you want to say rather than responding right away. This idea of long takes for me emphasizes that. This idea that when somebody's speaking, to give them that space and that time, and to give that time to the listener also to absorb that. If you're going too quickly, they might not have time to absorb everything that's being said. The next thing is the use of silence. So in film, we would even create white noise or ambient noise for quiet moments so that it's never completely silent. You always have something giving you feedback. You're always hearing something in the frame. But in a lot of these Indigenous films, there's straight up silence, which is very shocking to the listener, especially if you're in a theater. You're really aware of what's around you and the fact that you're watching a film and that this is a construction. But again, it's that idea of listening and giving air to those moments. And finally, these inclusions of things that I would see would be as mistakes until we look at them a little bit further. So this is a film by Clint Starr, Clint Alberta, Clint Karate Champ, he has many last names, an incredible filmmaker. And this is one of his films called Deep Inside Clint Starr, which is a look into Indigenous sexuality. But he only talks to his friends, which I think is really fascinating. Again, talking about narrative, he's choosing to talk to his friends. And in this scene here, he's talking to his friend and he tells her, you can see in the top right corner, I'm not even gonna look at you. I'm just gonna look straight ahead. You're not even gonna have a chance to see me. And you're just gonna have to talk like that. And it seems to be a joke. Don't really know why he did that, but he's standing away from her, won't look at her, until finally they're having this conversation about drinking and alcohol. And she explains that there was a sexual assault in her history. And as his friend, he was really shocked to hear that, and he immediately breaks this facade of I'm going to look away from you and starts looking at her right away. And he's interacting with her and he's comforting her. And finally, at the end of it, he looks up and he goes, that's enough for today. I think we're done. So he gives her the opportunity to share that, but once it's done, makes sure she's okay and says, okay, we're done now. And you can hear him say to the camera, is that okay? Can we be done? And the camera goes, yeah, I think that's good. He goes, okay, we're done. Let's just walk around. And so first of all, you would never include you talking to the cameraman or the cameraman talking back in a film, ever. But also you can see here at one point the boom mic, which comes over the top of the set, the screen is visible, and you would never include that. But right now she's telling a really important story. So you're not going to cut that, and you're not going to edit it strangely. They only had one camera, so they're not going to just try to like adjust it right away or make it tighter. And over here, he's making this strange, I'm not even going to look at you, which is quite a strange interview choice in general. But when he breaks that, that's a really authentic moment that we see. And that long take lets us see that entire moment. And then when she's done, and he says, okay, that's enough. One of the things that was special to me about including that entire thing is it shows that first, it was her choice to share that story. She wanted it to be shared. And as a Nitawâhtâw, it's our responsibility to let that story be shared because she chose that. But second, to show the care. I'm not just gonna extract this story from you and then take it as this, fantastical moment that I get to now be famous for. You decided to share that. I hold that for you. You're okay, let's be done. So that shows the ethics of it. So it's showing two things that would never be shown on film and were strange choices in general, but they tell really meaningful pieces of information in this story. And so again, it goes away from those Hollywood and those traditional aesthetics and rules that we have as filmmakers. And I think that's a very important and intentional decision. I don't think it was an accident. And finally, the most important part for me is the presence of the filmmaker. So in the narrative, we're choosing things that are close to us, but also we're putting ourselves physically in front of the camera. So in Foster Child, Gail Cardinal is on his own film. In Women in the Shadows, Christine Welsh is on her own film. Clint Alberta in his own film. And then sometimes when we're not, Alanis Obonswin is another famous one. She's constantly in her films. But when we're not, it's quite obvious. And so Christine Welsh did this film called Cooper Island, Return to the Healing Circle. And this was about the residential school experience of these particular community members from this particular residential school. Her family did not go there. She's not from this area. This is actually close to Victoria here. And so in this film, she's not there whatsoever. She's not in a voiceover either, which she does commonly in her films. She only uses a yellow text over top. This was so not about her, so she didn't put anything of herself that she didn't have to. It was all about the voices of the community. It was all about their voiceovers. It was all about their interviews, because it so wasn't about her. So she really created that space for them. And that was a really important choice to make, where typically she is in her films. And this idea of the corporeal image is important, especially on a theoretical level, that the film is as much affected by the bodies behind the camera as those before it, is an important thing to remember, because even though she's had herself completely removed, it doesn't mean she doesn't have an effect on the film. So in that way, she's choosing not to be on camera, but still acknowledges the effect that she's going to have. By acknowledging the effect you're going to have, you can make more intentional decisions about whether or not you're on film, whether or not you do a voiceover, that kind of thing. And she asked us whose story is being told. And again, a quote from her on the bottom of my slide here is, "Don't ask anyone to go somewhere you are not willing to go yourself," which I think is a really special quote to have. In this film, in this moment where they're laughing here, they're talking about some really upsetting, deep stories, these two brothers, and then one of them cracks a joke about the other, and they start laughing, and you can hear Christine laughing off screen, and you don't expect the humor to come then, but it does. And she kept that in. Again, as a Hollywood producer, you go, well, I haven't been in this whole film, and now you can hear me laughing? Like, can't use that. But it was such a beautiful moment, and it was such a raw moment, and it really showed the resiliency and the humor that these people have. And so she chose to keep that, and I think that was a powerful decision to make. And it shows me that she's going there with them emotionally. She's reacting with them, she's moving with them. And I think that that's an interesting thing to think about as we move forward is, do I want to be in the film? If I'm going to be in the film, what am I asking of them? Am I willing to go there with them and experience that with them? And what's really beautiful to me about including yourself in the film is that you're showing responsibility. So I'm going to be showing you in a minute a sound walk that I did with a man from the Cowichan First Nation. And what was special to me about that is I chose to include myself entirely, because one of my important ethics was to show what questions I was asking of that person. It can be easy to twist someone's word. We hear that a lot in reality TV. You ask one question, you get one answer, and you use it for something else. But if you have me asking you that question, you know exactly how I asked it, you know exactly what words I used, the emotion that I had, and so it's much more clear why they had the reaction that they did. And Alanise Odontsuwin uses that quite frequently. She had, in Kanisatake, 500 Years of Resistance, it's an incredible film, she interviews a man from the other side, if you will. And she's being quite pushy with him, like really defending herself and being quite forward with him. And so his reactions are quite upset. He seems quite upset. But it's interesting to see how he responds to her calm, collected, forward questions. And that, I think, shows more about his reaction to see the emotions that inspired his reaction. So including yourself is also about ethics. It's not just about editing choices. My work now is become a lot more film-centered than it was before. Before it was quite auditorily based. I'm becoming more interested in film, so this work has really been helpful for me moving forward. And recently I worked with my classmates here at a sacred Cowichan site called Yiyamnuts. And here we worked with my professor here, Brian Tom, and with other community members to commemorate this important ancestral site and community site. And this is a good example, and I'd like to share a little bit with you of the work that I'm doing now. It's all auditory based, but you can see again my presence of the filmmaker, if you will, or the author with my voice. You can hear the kinds of questions that I ask, and you can hear me relating my culture and my teachings to him as well as a form of asking respectful questions. I'm very fascinated in this idea of acoustemology, which is ways of knowing through sound, so acoustics plus epistemology. I think that as Indigenous people who are oral and aural, we have strong connections to sound and listening, and I'm very fascinated in exploring those, this idea of the voice and listening as being central to the way that we know and the way that we communicate with one another. And moving into my master's research, I'm going to be working with Indigenous folks and their experiences of accessing healthcare, and it's going to be, again, very community engaged, but also collaborative. I really want to take this Kiskin very seriously, this idea of working together on something. And so I'd like to share that with you, if that's okay.
Were you over here when that oak tree was standing?
No, I wasn't.
We used to cross, literally cross right there. And I went to Quamchin Middle School, as it was coined back then. Just across at that oak tree. At the time, I didn't know. So for those of us that were a bit more able-bodied, I guess, we would try and jump as far across as we could, because it was so muddy-bottomed, and this was all this was farm fields, and there were no houses at all here. And we would, for PE, we would run through here. It was called the mud run. And it's funny, because we used to joke that we would come back and sort of sneak into the farm and go hunting here. And it's funny because there were like no houses, it was just farm fields. And you don't really notice immediately the level of change. Something has to put it into context for you. And it was really striking through here. There were many more oaks, and it was a quiet oasis. Everybody hated to go and do the mud run, but I just loved it. And it was, well, people like to walk out in the woods because it's quiet and you can reflect. If you're out here, no matter what time of year, there is always something happening if you're paying attention. The fact that the Stellar's jays are out, tells you when they're nesting, they are absolutely quiet and silent the whole time in their nesting period. Before they go to nest and before they're really settling, then they'll be loud. Post-season, after they're nesting, they're loud. They're not just communicating, they're kind of celebrating and announcing, right? You know where they are. They're related to crows. They're corvids. So they have very distinct, prominent personalities. And it's like that for everything out here. Come together. That we will actually start to deal with some of these issues with a much stronger mandate and directive. And it's not until you do that that you will actually succeed. One of our teachings is that if whether it's a project or an endeavor, if you're trying to succeed in something and something keeps going wrong, you have to think about how it's all put together. And sometimes you have to completely disassemble it.
Right.
And start over.
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily anything individual thing, but it's not really meant to be.
Yeah.
Until you have everything right. And then in our language, then the work will look after itself.
Yeah. In my teaching, we bead. And if your beading is not working, the thread is breaking, the beads are falling off. Yes. It's not time to bead that yet.
That's so true.
It's not time to bead that yet.
It's that way. Well, that's it. That's a fundamental aspect to the way people learn if they have been in the same place for a long time. There's that understanding. As children, if we went into our grandparents' house, and I don't know, we were a bit too amped up from playing, or were angry, or just weren't quite in the right mindset, one of our grandparents would stop us in the middle of the living room, or even before we came in the door. Go back outside, or go for a walk. I don't think people fully understand that unless you have some semblance of the language or have that kind of upbringing and say, go fix yourself and then come back. And you go, and you might even just be, I remember the first time walking away, I was like, what on earth are they talking about? Nothing wrong with me.
I'm fine.
I'm fine. Go for a walk and come back. And, what was I thinking about again? You come back and you're all smiling and happy. Anyway,
Yeah.
it's, I don't know, it's just once you have a bit of time to actually think about it and deal with that practice, or you've smashed your thumb or whatever, or stabbed it with a needle. Yes.
Yeah.
Then it'll...
Then it's time to take a rest and come back.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in this, one of the reasons I wanted to show it to you is the inclusion of myself. So part of the reason that that's important is that typically in a traditional interview, like such as this, especially in a research context, you would say your piece, you'd ask the question, you get a long answer from them, and that's the part that you keep. But purposefully, I kept my part in with his so that you could hear the questions that I was asking, again, as part of my research ethics, but also as a way to show how I influenced what we were talking about, and show the kinds of conversations we were having and how I had that respectful conversation. So you notice sometimes I would ask a direct question, but also I said, in my teachings, blah, blah, blah. And that inspired him to say something else. I didn't have to ask a direct question, I just had to show I was listening. And I had to show how I related it to myself. And so by keeping my part of the conversation in, you're also hearing that there's a relationship between the two of us, and I feel like honoring the relationship that we built together. We had a really nice moment there, and you can tell because we're laughing together. I also have, this is a long take, so I didn't put in the sound of the airplane. This was a sound walk, so we walked together with lapel microphones on that sit right here. And we were talking about this site and how it's such an important cultural site. There's all this development around it, and he talks about how it's so hard to find a quiet place. Meanwhile, this airplane's going back. And so that is not edited, that's real. And so, yes, you would typically be like, that's too loud, I don't want, it's covering what we're talking about, I don't want that, and that would be a really big downside. But for me, it was exactly highlighting what we were doing and exactly highlighting what we were talking about. And in our conversations, we started talking about the land and the birds and the development, and we slowly began to talk about the issues with sovereignty and the issues with the tension between cultural and developmental areas, and this connection of culture together. So again, you get to listen to that 16 minutes of going from the land and talking about the place that we were in to the issues that we're dealing with and the culture that we have together. So even though it's not a film, you can see presence of the filmmaker, you can see those editing choices, and you can see that the narrative I chose was, again, this individual, but I chose to include myself and my culture as a way to include myself in the narrative. As a way to show him I was listening and relate to him so that it's more together, but also as a way to show my ethics to those watching and listening. At this point, I just wanted to say thank you for you two for having me, but also to all my elders, my ancestors, my family here, and to my supervisor, my classmates. This is, again, learning together, Kiskin Nitawâhtâw, learning together and listening. So I'm very grateful to have listened to all of you, and thank you for listening to me today. Hi, hi, Exe.